Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 40 from the Road to Latin textbook. Now the first story is called De Si Mucio I, right? And we're going to go into the legendary heroes of Rome and kind of come back to that theme, which we've been looking at a little bit as we've gone through the most recent chapters. Now before we dive too far into it, like I always tell you, if you want more resources on this chapter, the story, anything, feel free to take a look at my website. You can find grammar notes there, different explanation videos, vocab, Quizlets, just a lot of stuff that might help you unpack what's going on in these chapters. So feel free to check it out. Now, before we dive into the translation, like I always tell you, we're going to start by doing a little bit of grammar, which of course we will do. But the other thing I would always recommend that you do is start with the vocab. When you have a new chapter, make sure that you know the vocab really well, right? It's very hard to understand what's going on if you just don't know what the words are. So always start with the new vocab list, practice it, master it, make sure you feel really, really comfortable with it before you move on. The next thing I would recommend you do is read this story aloud, right? So find someone in class you can read it to. If you read it to them and they read it back to you, you're working on your speaking, your pronunciation, and your listening when they read it to you. These are all great things. You don't want to shut them off and just kind of do this in your head. So I'd encourage that you find someone to do that with. And the last thing I always recommend is try the read and reread method, right? So when you read through, mark down any problem areas you have, make a list. When you get to the end of the story, look at your list and try to figure out where you're going wrong. If it's vocab, that's really easy, right? It's an easy fix. Just look up the words. If it's grammar, it's probably going to be the grammar from this chapter. So that could be a sign you just need to go look through the grammar notes and understand it a little better. If it's old grammar, maybe it's like something about a tense or verbs, whatever. You can look it up and try to figure out where you're going wrong so you know what to practice, right? But then you go back and read the story again. And on the second, third, fourth time, whatever it is, you should be having a list that gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you can read through the whole thing without needing to write anything down, right? You understand everything. You have no problem areas. That's how you know you're in a really good place and you're ready to move on. But before we get into all that, like I said, we're going to start with a little bit of grammar, okay? So we're going to do a quick overview before we dive into the story. This is not everything, but it'll just give you an overview of what the chapter was about so you can look for these when you actually read the story. So we're coming to adverbs in this chapter. So we learned about degrees of adjectives, right, back in chapter 37. And you learn things like good, better, best, or happy, and happier, all these different things. We call those the positive, comparative, and the superlative. You can do the same thing with adverbs because you want to remember adverbs are words that modify verbs, adjectives, or even other adverbs, right? So they have that sense of an adjective to them, which means you can use different degrees, right? Just like you did with adjectives. So this will be the difference between saying, she is happy, which is an adjective, versus she walks happily, which is an adverb, right? Happily is describing or modifying the verb. Okay, so adverbs have these same degrees, but they're formed differently. And it depends on what adjective they came from, right? So remember, adverbs come from adjectives. So if you had a first or second declension adjective that you can turn into an adverb, that's going to be slightly different than if you have a third declension adjective. So that can feel like a lot to process right away, but I'll show you it's actually not that bad, okay? So let's start with the positive degree, right? This is just the most simple form of an adverb, okay? Basically the ly version in English. So when you have a first or second declension adjective, to form the positive, you just get rid of the usa ending and you replace it with a long e. You can see that in the chart below. So strenuous becomes strenue, right? So the adjective strenuous rather becomes strenuously. That's its adverb form. Carus becomes care, ignavus becomes ignawe, and lightus becomes lighte. All we've done, you can see in the red here, is we're swapping that ending for a long e, and you have what we call the positive adverb, right? The ly version. And you can use these to modify or describe verbs. Now, if you have a third declension adjective, it's a little bit different. So basically the ending you're looking for is ter, and I put the I here in parentheses because sometimes it's actually iter, depending if you had an I in the actual adjective form. So it's either iter or ter, or sometimes if you have an adjective where the stem of it, right, becomes an nt, you already have the t there, you just add an er. So let me show you what I mean. So in the chart below, you have audax, right, which means bold. That would become audacter. And the reason we know this is because the genitive is audacus, right? It has that C on the end of it. So since we have a C, you just add the ter ending, right? So you have audacter, which means boldly. For brewis, we have an I there, right? So we're going to make it iter. It's going to become brewiter, right? So if you get rid of the is, because it already had an I there originally, right, you keep the I and you have brewiter, briefly. Same thing is happening with fortis, becoming fortiter. Now, on the last one, you have vehemens, which means violent, right? The genitive form is vehementius. It has an nt when I get rid of the is, so I'm not going to add another t to my ending. I just add an er. Okay, so the long story short is when you have third declension adjectives, when it's a positive adverb, you're looking for something with an ER on the end of it. That's usually how I describe it to my students so they don't get confused. It could be a TER or an ITER, and it's harder to make these on your own, but reading it is actually easier to spot because of that ER ending. Okay, so again, third declension adjectives use that TER or ER. First and second declension adverbs use the long E. Okay. Now, what about the other two degrees? We have comparative and superlative. So to make the comparative, all you do is use the ending IUS, which is the neuter singular adjective ending, right? Comparative adjective ending. So you're going to use the same thing, right, for an adverb. For superlative adverbs, you just put that long E ending on the superlative ending from the adjective, which is usually something like issemus, right, would become issime. So if we look at a chart, right, again, I'm trying to go a little quickly so we don't get too bogged down in it, but it would look like this. If I had the adjective lightus, right, there's my adjective. It's a first and second declension adjective, so the positive adverb becomes lighte, right? I highlighted the E in red. The comparative is lightius. There's that IUS ending. That means more happily. Right? And the superlative is lightissime, right? Instead of lightissimus, we put an E on the end of it, okay? So lighte, lightios, lightissime. For brevis, which is a third declension adjective, we would have breviter, which means briefly, brevius, which means more briefly, and brevissime, right? The most briefly, okay? So the only time it's going to be really different in the superlative would be if you had something like keller, right? That's where we use the RRIME ending, right? Kellerime, there's no issime there. But otherwise, they look very similar to those superlative adjectives, which is why we do them after usually in a textbook, but they have the long E ending. Okay, so if you look at a chart like this, and again on my textbook, I kind of put more notes that help you through it, you'll realize that it does feel a little complicated, but you can get the hang of it pretty quickly, enough to be able to spot it in the story, I would say. Even if you're having trouble forming it in your own head, you should be able to spot it pretty quickly when you're reading Latin. So just look through that and you should be okay. Now, when it comes to degrees of adjectives, of course, there are some exceptions, right? There's a few words that the Road to Latin textbook points out as having slightly different positive forms. So if you look here, in the positive adverb column on the left, you have diu, saipe, and sero, right? Those just look weird. They're a little irregular. But in the comparative and the superlative, it follows the same pattern. So you have diutius, saipius, serius, right? And then diutissime and saipissime and serissime. So the pattern is only weird in that positive form. And these you just kind of learn by practicing, right? The more you do it, the easier these are going to be able to be for you to spot. Okay? The last thing is there are irregular degrees of adjectives, right? These you just have to kind of memorize. So they're the equivalent of the irregular adjectives, like good, better, best, right? You have well, better, and best, right? So you go bene, melius, optime, which just looks a little weird and gets some used to, right? Get some getting used to. But even there, you can see that it's actually not as weird as you might think. The positive ends in an E, right? Which feels kind of familiar. The comparative is still using the IUS ending for a lot of them. And the superlative has something, it might be an issime or a lime, right, with that E on the end of it. So the reason I'm saying this is it is irregular, but it's not completely out of left field when you do these. And these are best done by memorizing or just practicing, right? If you read through Road to Latin, you'll see a lot of examples of this and you should be able to figure it out pretty quickly. Okay, so that was a quick overcap of a very complicated at time grammar lesson. Again, this is just to give you something to look for when we go through the rest of the story. I would highly encourage you to go back, if you haven't, run through the grammar, make sure you have a good sense of it and you feel pretty comfortable with it, because the Road to Latin stories use the grammar in the context of the story. So if you have a head start on it, you'll know what to look for as we read through these stories. Okay, so you haven't done that, pause the video, go back and do it. Otherwise, let's read through the actual story. We'll point these out as we go. And again, as long as your translation is pretty close to mine, you should feel pretty comfortable that you're on the right track. Okay? So again, this story is about a man, Gaius Mucius, right? We'll see what this is all about. But it starts like this. You have fabulam legimus de Horatio, qui Etruscos a ponte prohibuit. Okay, so we read legimus, right? We read a story about Horatius, de Horatio, who prohibited or stopped the Etruscans a ponte, at the bridge, right? So it's recapping what we already know. We already read a story about Horatius. Then you have quam Lars Porsena ita ab Horatio pulsus erat, tamen ab urbe Roma non discessit. So although Lars Porsena, there's our subject, remember he's the Etruscan king, although he pulsus erat, he had been repulsed, you might say, in this way, ita, by Horatius, right? So in this way, he had been repulsed ab Horatio, by Horatius. However, he did not depart, non discessit, right? It's perfect tense. He did not depart from the city, right? Ab urbe Roma, from the city of Rome. So even though he had been kind of repelled by Horatius, he didn't actually leave, right? The siege continued. Then you have longe lateque, castra eos in repus tiberis pertinebant. Okay, so here we have a phrase that you see a lot as we go through this, but these are adverbs. So you have longe lateque, right? So longe et late is another way to say it. So this is a way of translating far and wide, rather. It means something like longly and widely, you might say, as you kind of think of it in it more literally. But the way you want to translate is far and wide. Okay, so far and wide, castra eos, his camp, pertinebant, was stretching, right? So his camp was extending on the banks of the river Tiber, right, in Ripis Tiberis, right? So his camps are stretching far and wide on the banks of the Tiber River. So he's got a massive camp and a massive army, right? So he's still there. Then you have Porsenae castra longius et latius quam Roma ipsa pertinebant. So here we have comparative adverbs, longius et latius. So we had longe and late, those are the positive. Now we have longius et latius, right? So it's meaning like more far and more wide, you might say. So the camp of Porsena, right? So the castra Porsenae, the camp of Porsena extended longer and wider than Rome itself, right? Quam Roma ipsa. Remember, comparatives are used in comparison. So it's saying it's longer and wider than Rome itself, right? The quam is your comparative word there. Okay? Then you have rex Etruscorum quod victus erat iratissimus erat. So the king of the Etruscans, right, the rex Etruscorum, right, the king of the Etruscans, Porsena, because he victus erat, he had been defeated, right, there's your pluperfect passive, he was the most angry or very angry, iratissimus erat, right, there's your superlative, okay, just your superlative adjective, he was very angry. Then it continues, and you have itaque trans flumen tiberum castra posuerat et Roma obsideba. So across the Flumen Tiberum, right, the Tiber River, he had placed posuerat, he had set up, you might even say pitched his camp, castra posuerat. He had pitched camp across the Tiber River and besieged Rome. So obsidebat Romam, he was besieging Rome, right, the city. Then you have senatores Romani, castra in omnes partes longissime et latissime pertinentia viderunt. So the Roman senators, the senatores Romani, right, the Roman senators, viderunt, they saw the camp, right, so they saw the castra, right, in omnes partes, in all parts, and the camp is described as pertinentia. There's your participle, right, your present participle. So extending or stretching, longissime et latissime, the farthest and the widest, or very far and very wide, you might say. These are your superlative adverbs, right, longissime and latissime. This is different from iratissimus we just saw, which had a US ending. These have the long E ending. They're superlative adverbs. They're describing the stretching, right? They're stretching far and wide, or very far and very wide. Okay, so the Roman senators look out, and all they can see is the camp of the Etruscans. Itaque timore magno per moti sunt. So moti sunt, they were moved by fear. Magno per means very much or greatly, right? They were greatly moved by fear. There's your irregular adverb. Okay, so they were moved by fear. Omnes magno in periculo erant. So everyone was in great danger. Magno periculo, right? So all, meaning all the residents, are in trouble, right? They're in great danger. Then you have nemo ex urbe excedere poterat. Nemo in urbem procedere poterat. So nobody, right? You have nemo, so nobody here and nobody there. So nobody was able, right? Nobody was able, poterat, right, to go out of the city, ex urbe excedere, to sort of depart from the city. So no one could get out. And nemo in urbem procedere poterat. No one was able to go into the city. So no one was able to get out. No one was able to get in. The city is besieged. Okay. Then you have interim, Romae erat maxima inopia frumenti. Okay. So meanwhile, right, in Rome, Romae there is locative, right, it's inside Rome, there was a maxima in opia frumenti, there was a great scarcity in opia, frumenti of grain, right, of food is basically what it means, right, so there's no food because the city is besieged. Then you have frustras, senatores auxilium ad deis immortalibus petiverunt. So in vain, the senators, right, they sought help, petiverunt, as they looked for, they sought auxilium, help. There's your direct object. So they sought help from the deis immortalibus, from the immortal gods. So the senators are looking for help. They're praying to the gods, but there's nothing they can do, right? They're in trouble here. Then you end with this line. You have famem mortemque miserrime expectaba. Okay, so they were looking for, right? And here we have miserrime, which is again, it's a superlative form, but it's an adverb. You can tell by that long e ending. So miserrime, it means it's describing how they were looking, right? Expectaban here. So they were most miserably expecting or looking for famem mortemque, famine and death, right? So they're just waiting to die because there's no food. Then you have the next paragraph, and you have C. Mucius, right? Caius Mucius, era nobilis juvenis magna virtute. So Gaius Mucius, and by the way, Road to Latin gives you a note that C and G are the same letter, right? That early Latin alphabet didn't have a difference between it, didn't have the G. So C is Caius or Gaius. You can hear it, and that comes back from the Greek alphabet, which was alpha, beta, gamma, right? So C and G are basically interchangeable here, right? But you have Gaius Mucius. He was a noble youth, right? A nobilis juvenis, right? He was a noble young man, you might say. With great virtue, magna virtute, right? So he's got this great virtue about him. Ad senatores viros maxima auctoritate fortite venet et audacter dixit. Right, so he goes, or he went, fortiter, right? So he bravely, you would say, there's your adverb. He bravely came to the senators, right? Ad senatores, and by the way, they're senators. They're described as men, viros, with the great authority or great power, right? Maxima auctoritate, there is your ablatus, so men of great power. He came to them bravely, and he said boldly, audacter, right? There's your adverb again. The ter ending gives it away. So he boldly said, and you have a quote here. He says, Lars Porsena, vir audacissimus inquit, Romam jam diu obside. Okay? So Lars Porsena, right? The boldest man. There you have your superlative adjective, audacissimus, weird, right? So the boldest man is besieging Rome, right? Jam diu means for a long time, right? Now for a long time. So it's saying for a long time, he's been besieging Rome, right? Obsidet. And again, diu there is your adverb, right? For a long time. Then he said, it's one of the irregulars, by the way. Then he says, diutissime cives nostros perteruit. Right? So for the longest time, there's your superlative. It's the irregular adverb, but the superlative form, the issime, gives it away. So for the longest time, he has frightened our citizens, cives nostros, right? So he says he's been here a long time, and now for the longest time, he's been terrorizing everyone. Then he asks a question. He says, diutiusne eum tolerare debemus, or debemus, rather. So he says, should we, debemus there means like we ought or we should. So in the question form, you'd say, should we tolerate, or ought we to tolerate is kind of what it means. But should we tolerate? It goes with the infinitive. Him, eum, diutios, right? Any longer, right? Longer. So he says, should we tolerate him, longer, right? Keep this going. Then you have the continuation. You have ego solus ad castra hostium celerite procedere volo. Okay, so I alone, ego solus, I alone, or I by myself, I alone want, volo, to procedere, to depart or to go out. Celeriter, there's your adverb, right? Your positive adverb, quickly, from the camp, to the camp, ad castra, to the camp of our enemy, right? Of the enemy. So he says, I alone want to go out, proceed out, right? Quickly to the camp of the enemy. And he says, non celerius quam ego sagita ipsa volabit. So here we have non celerius, which means not faster. There's our adverb, right? And it's the comparative form. So not faster than I, quam ego, right? Not faster than I. An arrow itself, a sagita ipsa, an arrow itself will fly. So it's saying an arrow itself will not fly faster than me. Meaning I'm going to go sort of like Superman, faster than a speeding bullet, right? Faster than an arrow. And he says, ego enim, civis Romanos, ab hoc periculo, et ab his hostibus celerime liberabo. Right, so he makes this dramatic speech. He says, for I, a civis Romanus, a Roman citizen, will very quickly, celerime, right? There's our superlative adverb. I will very quickly free, liberabo, right? Will liberate cives Romanos, the Roman citizens, from this danger, ab hoc periculo, from this danger, and from these enemies, ab his hostibus. So he comes in with this, declarative statement of, I alone am going to do this, right? I am a Roman citizen, and I'll go save the rest of the Roman citizens from all these problems, okay, from Lars Porsena and the Etruscans. Then he asks a question to end. He says, probatisne mea consilia, right? So he says, will you approve, right? Probatis, right? Or do you approve mea consilia, my plan, right? So he says, do you approve what I'm saying, right? My plans here, right? Are you going to let me do this is basically what he's asking. Then we end with this paragraph, right? And this is the end of the story. You have senatores haec verba diligenter cogitantes ita responderunt. Okay, so the senators, thinking about cogitantes, right? Understanding or thinking carefully, diligenter. There's your adverb, right? Remember, cogitantes is a present participle, but since participles are verbs, you can use adverbs to modify them. So thinking carefully about these words, right? Or kind of considering these words carefully, you might say. They responded thus, in this way. And they say, bene dixisti, Caius Muci, right? So you spoke well, Gaius Mucius, right? Bene dixisti, you spoke well. Ne senator quidem melius dixit, right? Not even a senator, right? A senator spoke better. Melius dixit, right? Melius there is your comparative, your irregular comparative adverb, right? Spoke better. Then they say, nam, Lars Porsena vir maxima audacia male egit. So for Lars Porsena, a man with the greatest boldness, right? The greatest or the most boldness, the greatest boldness, male egit, acted badly. You could say egit is the perfect tense of ago, right? So acted badly. Male there is your irregular adverb, right? Just it's the positive form, badly, right? So it's saying he acted badly. Nulli hostes umquam peus egerot, right? So no enemies ever, right? Umquam ever did worse things, you might say, right? Egerot means like did, peus means worse, okay? So the peus there is the irregular comparative, right? Think bad, worse, worst, okay? So saying no one ever did anything as bad as this guy, right? There's your irregular peus. It's describing egera, right? So no enemies ever did worse things. Lars Porsena pessime egit quod nostram urbem sine causa appugnavit. So Lars Porsena acted, egit, right? He kind of did or acted, pessime, the worst. There's your superlative of your irregular adverb. So pessime is describing egit, acted worse, right? So Lars Porsena acted the worst because he appugnavit, he besieged our city, nostram urbem, sine causa, without cause, right? So that he just showed up and he attacked our city. He didn't have a cause. No one's ever, behaved worse than this guy. Si tua consilia optime perfeceris, populo Romano maximum beneficium dabis et a populo Romano semper ladeberis. Right? So they end with this sort of line. They say, if you will have accomplished, perfeceris, right? Future perfect. If you will have completed or accomplished tua consilia, your plan, optime, best, right? If you've done this, the best, okay? Optime is your adverb describing perfeceris, right? So if you will have done this, right, and done it well, right, very well, you will give, right? So you have dabis, right? You will give to the Roman people, right? Popolo Romano, maximum beneficium. You will be giving to the Roman people the greatest kindness, right? You are doing the greatest thing for your people. And laudeberis, you will be praised semper, always, a popolo Romano, right? By the Roman people. So you've done the greatest thing for the Roman people, and you will always be praised by the Roman people. So this is what Gaius Mucius is all about. We're going to see his real story. It comes in the second part of this chapter, right? We see what he did. But he steps up to the plate. And he demands that he wants to go alone and save the Roman Republic when nobody else would. Again, I'll put a link at the bottom of this video. If you haven't, I would encourage you to look up Mucius, right? Mucius Scaevola is going to be his nickname. Look him up because this is a really interesting story and famous story from early Roman history, right? Those heroes of Rome. And it's one that you should know. So I'll put a link if you want to kind of learn more about it. Feel free to check it out. But otherwise, keep working at the story. Hopefully it made sense and you feel pretty comfortable with your translation. But if there's anything you're not sure of or anything I went over or said that you're like, oh, I don't fully understand, just put it in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you and explain whatever needs to be explained. Just write it down there and I'll help you. Otherwise, keep at it, keep practicing. I know it's a new chapter with some trickier grammar. The more you work at it and read through this